Hey, what's up? John Aiken here with Dreamfire Films, of course. Thanks for checking out this free 3D robot model. This is the Puma exosuit Mech that I used in my little short film, Nerf Base Defense. It was originally modeled by Hoolis, who released it under the Creative Commons 3.0 license. I made some changes for my film, such as adding a head which came from a very cool model called Zephyr by Leafstorm, who released it to the public domain. These were originally created using the Blender internal render engine, so I set it up to work with Blender cycles and even added a little walking and shooting animation. And you get that all for free. Now this video is going to be a whole start to finish on how to add CG robots to your movie with Blender. But I've broken it up into sections and put the times in the description so you can jump to the section that you need, and I've labeled each section at the bottom of the video like this one here as introduction. If you use these assets, just remember to give credit to Leafstorm for the head and Hoolis for the Puma body and its textures. And for the HDRI images, we have Greg Zal at AdaptiveSamples.com and Giant Cow Films. This video is meant to answer most of your questions, so try to watch the whole thing at least once. So after you've downloaded the zip file from DreamfireFilms.com under Products and Free Puma Rainmaker, unzip it to see all the folders. First, there's the two free HDRIs. One that's going to give you a lot of white light in this field here, and another with a setting sun on this dirt clearing. This one gives the model a bit more of an orange color. In information, there's a screenshot of a really helpful walkthrough for the HDRIs if you get stuck. This was also created by Giant Cow Films. Alright, we're going to open the Blender file now, and as you can see, we're using version 2.78. I'll try to keep it updated with the latest versions of Blender if they have significant new features. Now, if you're wondering why my interface looks and possibly acts differently than yours, that's because I changed a few things in the preferences. You can go up here to File and User Preferences. Under Input, I changed the mouse click selection option to left click. And then under Themes, I changed the color scheme to be Ubuntu Ambience. And under System, I have CUDA turned on to use the graphics card, and I also increased the font size up in the top left to something around 100. Alright, if we close that, we can go to the Notes window, where you will see I left most of the original creator's notes from Hoolis. And in the 3D view, there is your brand new Puma Rainmaker model. The mech itself is on layer 2, the rig is on layer 3, some 3D muzzle flares and their lights are on layer 4, and the floor to catch the shadows is underneath on layer 11 in the corner here. Now if you hit Alt-A, you can see him walk, which he does for about 12 seconds or 300 frames until he starts doing something else. You know, like in case you need him to square dance or something, which comes up surprisingly often. We are also going to be working at 24 frames per second. Alright, animation. As you probably know, if you have an object selected, you get your usual modes in the interaction menu, but if you select the armature, which I might call the rig, you'll get to animate it. The easiest way to select this rig, while the model is visible, is to select the foot bone in between his giant toes here. In object mode, he looks normal, but in edit mode, you're going to notice that he goes into this weird pose here. It's actually the original pose that this armature was in when it came out of the Carnegie Mellon University Library of Motion Capture Data. I had to then alter it to fit the very wide frame that this robot has. There's probably not going to be a need to move the bones while in edit mode, and it might just cause problems, so I'd advise against it if you haven't done it before. Then, of course, you have pose mode, where you can change things frame by frame. If we open up the dope sheet, we can see those keyframes. Something to note is that it's mostly motion capture animation data making up these keyframes. That's why there's one on almost every frame. But for some things, like the guns and the head, I had to get rid of the old keyframes and animate them to keep them always pointing forward. Otherwise, they were swinging all willy-nilly like unacceptable, because the original actor wasn't holding Gatling guns, and that's what all these thin purple lines are sticking out of him. Those are empties that are controlling things like the spinning Gatling guns and the direction of the head. They're listed in the dope sheet as head turn, empty, hold left, and right Gatling gun. And as you can see here, even in the armature, I edited the forearms to point straight ahead. If you want to add a new action for the robot before or after his walking and shooting, there's actually a fairly easy way to do that. and I think it isn't given enough credit or attention. It's with the NLA editor, or non-linear animation editor. So to start, switch from the dope sheet to the NLA editor, and here's all your keyframes on the armature itself. Click these two down arrows, which is considered pushing it down onto a new strip, which is just a new layer or track if you're used to video editing. Now it's as if all those keyframes are frozen or flattened into this one thing. Then say you only want him to walk for 5 seconds, about half the total time here. Then you want him to get shot and die. You can actually just trim off the rest of this animation by hitting N to get these settings on the right, and go down to Action Extents, the end frame, and slide that one. Now notice the model does not change his current position, so he's just standing there, because we are only trimming the end of that animation. But it's easy to confuse this with the other slider higher up called Strip Extents. Alright, I'm going to undo that other trim with Control-Alt-Z, which is really cool. It'll bring up a list of all my last changes, which I like to use over regular Control-Z, as I can be positive of what I'm undoing or redoing. I'm going to go to Strip Extents, End Frame, and slide that. And as you can see, he is moving, because this one is not like trimming the end or just the right side of the strip. It's like pushing the whole strip left while at the same time cutting off the beginning. So it's like combining two edits in one, and you're probably going to find yourself using this once you've gotten used to it, but definitely don't mix it up with Action Extents, because you don't want to find out down the road that you used the wrong one and totally messed up an already complex animation. So just be careful of that. So we'll trim the strip down a little, make sure we have the armature selected, and go into pose mode. And a little ways before the end of this strip, we're going to put a keyframe for location and rotation. So set it down in the bottom right, and hit the key icon to the right of it to place a keyframe. Then hit the red dot to the left to turn on auto keyframing, so that Blender adds keyframes every time we move our model. Also hit the keychain icon next to it so that it only auto keyframes the location and rotation, like how we set it up. Then we'll move a little ways ahead and move him a little bit as if he's getting shot and starting to fall. If you hit R twice, you get to rotate things in a different, more 3D way, what they like to call trackball rotation. And you can do just about any rotation without having to change your view. So he's flailing around a little, and I'm moving forward and moving him again, and his hip bone, which moves his entire rig, so it's like his center of gravity. Then we'll go a little further and animate him falling further. It's good to open the dope sheet too, so you can edit the timing of these keyframes to make them faster or slower. This is a pretty basic animation, so if you're looking for realism, that's going to take way more time. And moving him around more. And we're going to move his legs a little. And you know what? Why not give him a little bit of bounce? You know, it's my animation, and I'm going to make him do whatever I want. And play back with Alt-A, and wow, that is the slowest animation I have ever seen. Except for that time that squirrel drank coffee in that movie Over the Hedge, and everyone else slowed down but him. Yeah, that was awesome. Alright, that's fine. If we select all those keyframes I just made in the dope sheet here, then have the playhead at the start of them, and hit S to scale, and we're now perfectly shrinking them down towards the beginning. And there you have it, an Academy Award-winning performance. If I ran the Academy Awards, then we will hit these two arrows again to push down the animation onto its own strip. And at the moment, you can see how it just starts that new action very abruptly, but if we hit this magical button called the Auto Blend In / Out button, we can see how it automatically blended those two animations together. And alright, yeah, now it looks kind of like he's just tripping and face planting, but Let's just say his weakness is small rocks or something. But the point is that anything you animate can be meshed together with anything else you animate, or as Blender calls them, actions. Hit the blend button on the other action strip to have that one fade out too into the first one. This is especially helpful if, let's say, you have your own motion capture suit, which nowadays go for around $1,000, whereas previously you needed a pretty pricey full camera rig studio not that long ago. I've even seen people rig up an Xbox Kinect with some extra software and get some pretty good motion captures from just pointing at themselves. Now that's an affordable solution. The last step is to finalize it or bake these actions into one animation. First, figure out exactly which frame all of these actions start and end on. Select the strips and go to pose mode, and be sure to select all the bones and go back to object mode. And go up to your 3D view, hit T for the left side properties, go to the animation tab and hit bake action. Here we can input those start and end frames. Then select overwrite and set bake data as pose, because we want to bake the poses, not the objects themselves. Then you get a new set of keyframes for all those bones with those two actions combined. You can then delete the old animation strips if you want. Let's say you're fine with the current animation walking thing, because who wouldn't be? Let's move on to how the textures are set up. When it comes to the overall look of the robot, you have two options to choose from. One is this black robot that I made from taking Hulis's original textures, turning it from green to black, and using fewer images to decrease my render times. The original textures look like this, and there's one for the legs, arms, front torso, back torso, main Gatling gun ammo clip cylinder, the shoulder gun, and this little back unit device thing. So I'm sure these took Hulis a very long time to make, and they look amazing. For my short film, however, I wanted a darker looking robot, and I wanted to see if I could also save processing power by using less textures. So what I did was I took just the arms textures, tweaked it a little, darkened it, added more of these white markings, and used it for all of the armor plates around the body. And for my needs, it worked out pretty good. My movie was mostly just one big shootout video game scene anyway, so the shots of the robots are usually pretty quick, and any duplication of the textures wouldn't be all that noticeable. And I like the gritty, patched together look that this one texture gave it all of the parts. So that's what he is set to as default, and if you want to switch him back to his original green texture, this is how you would do that. If you select an object, you'll get a few on the bone, and if you go to Materials tab, you'll see it has a single texture I called New Armor applied. You just have to switch it to Edit mode. I'm using the pie menus, which you can turn on in add-ons. Hit A to select all the polys, then select the Arms Armor Original, and hit Assign under it. You'll also notice that the viewport color of the mesh has changed a little. If you go around in object mode to all of the objects that have their own original textures, you can change them all, and you'll end up with the other green suit. Remember, the more textures that you use, especially when you start adding normal maps and specular maps, are gonna require more memory. And if you're using a graphics card to render your scene, it's possible to use up all the memory with these very large textures and the HDRI on top of that, and get yourself a CUDA error. So there's many things you can do using less textures, or reducing the sizes of the textures in Photoshop or GIMP, or just go ahead and use that texture that I made called the New Armor texture. Also note that some things, like the inner metal structure, is just a shiny black metal texture, so there's really no reason to change that one. Alright, let's move on to the actual node tree that makes it all work in Cycles here. Right now, I'm using Blender Guru's PBR Dielectric Shader from Andrew Price, who so nicely released it under the Creative Commons 0 public domain license, as well as his Less More sliders, which are really cool. PBR stands for Physically Based Rendering, which means if done right, you'll be able to get more photorealistic renders thanks to the physics of the materials interacting with the 3D world, just like they would in the real world. One major thing is the Fresnel, or very simply put, if you have an object with Fresnel on it, it will have brighter specular reflections closer to the edges. So here's just a glossy red ball with the Fresnel effect happening. It's that really, really reflective edge around it. It may seem like a small detail, but when Fresnel isn't present, your brain subconsciously picks up on it and perceives the render as just a tad fake. Now, for my node setup, I'm sure I don't have it perfect, but it's a good start, and there's a lot of options to tweak to match your scene the way you want it. I like to organize my nodes in a way that's easy for me to navigate, so here I put our main diffuse texture going into a brightness and contrast node and into the PBR's color input. Then if we move counterclockwise, you'll see I have the specular doing two jobs here. I didn't have a roughness map, so I just put the specular through a few nodes and then into the roughness. And I know I have two invert nodes here, but I went through a lot of trial and error, and somehow this setup gave me something I liked. But if you don't like how I have it set up here, you can just disconnect it and change this slider here. The color ramps do a good job of increasing the contrast when it comes to the specular and roughness, so I was able to really bring out the shininess in areas where the paint is and not where the rust and dirt is. Then I turned down the intensity with these less more sliders, and going around to the bottom, I put the normal map into the height input of a bump node, which seemed to give the best result. Again, you can try other nodes or combinations for your scene. Alright, HDRIs. If we click on the world, you'll see that there are a few HDRI setups. You can select either output node here on the right and flip between them, or the lone one, which turns them off, basically. On the left, I have it so that you can rotate the HDRIs around your model and the world. This rotation Z will spin it around him, or Y will send it overhead. If we go into the Render Settings tab and go down to Film and uncheck Transparency, you can see it better. If you can't see anything, or it's just like a blue color or something, try hitting 5 on the number pad to get you out of orthographic view. So you'll now see that if we change the Y value, that you can get the sun directly above him. But since it's a sun setting image, it's kind of unnatural looking, but it's still fun to play with and see what you can get. So let's check out the modifier for a second. Over here on the right, under the modifiers tab, we have a subdivision modifier on most of the robot to increase its realism, and here it's set to 2. But if we go under the scene tab, you'll see that I have simplify turned on down here, so that while working in the viewport, in your 3D viewport in the middle, all that extra geometry won't be there while you're working, and it won't slow down your machine. Alright, but let's talk about color management. Go down to color management. You'll see that we are using Filmic Log Encoding Base, also known as Filmic Blender, which even though you downloaded this folder, you probably won't have this here, because you have to install it. It's an important thing to have because it will give you more accurate color management. And if you're looking to make high quality videos and CG renders, you're going to want this. The old sRGB version that's here, that's the default when you download Blender, wasn't designed for making photoreal CG renders. It was more of a functional software for monitors. But trust me, I wouldn't be bothering with this if I didn't think it was important. So most likely when you get here, you see sRGB. And to change this, go to this GitHub page, which I'll put in the description, or it's usually the first link in Google if you just search Filmic Blender, and click Clone, or Download, and Download Zip. This was created by Troy Sabatka, who could have charged a lot of money, but is generously giving it away for free to us Blender users. If you want more information, he answers a lot of your questions on the page itself. Now unzip the file, and we need to copy it to another folder so that Blender can read it and use it. So on Windows, I like to hit Control-N to open another window at the same location, then navigate to the C drive, Program Files, Blender Foundation, Blender, the current version you're using, 2.78 for me, then Data Files. And this is the spot. And now with both windows open, Select Filmic Blender Master Folder, Control-C to copy it, and Control-V to paste it here. Now we're going to change the name of the old one. Hit F2 to rename. While the whole name is still here and selected, hit Control-C to copy it. Then just hit the down arrow to go to the end and type _old. Then rename the next one and hit Control-V to paste it. So now Blender will see this new one as the folder with all its important color management information. And this is what should be in that folder. So now you might have to save and close your Blender file, but you should now be able to switch from sRGB, EOTF to Filmic Log Encoding Base, also known as Filmic Blender. And then you get to choose looks down here. And the most common one that will give us something we're used to is base contrast. And you now have a way more powerful color management tool for rendering all of your high-end CG images. Since we're talking about color, if you go into your compositor window in the bottom, these are the color grading nodes that you can use to add contrast to the final image or give it a sci-fi blue tint or any other color to match your movie. If you're using Filmic Blender though, make sure you use the offset, power, and slope function in this drop-down and not the other ones there. Now we're going to get into tracking a live action shot to place the robot in. Before we start though, I want to give you an overview of some techniques that I used in my short film. I used After Effects for these, but the same principles apply to Blender and can be achieved with a little bit of reverse engineering of my steps. Firstly, in my opinion, it is always best, if possible, to lock down your camera on a tripod and leave it static for as many of your VFX shots as possible. Then add camera shake just later in post. This saves an enormous amount of time tracking a shot that maybe only had a very little bit of camera shake to begin with. When you have a static shot, you basically just drop the robot onto it and you're done. And then you can add your shake, shadows, other effects, and you're good. And I'll show you how to add this camera shake just to the frame itself after we've tracked our shot. Now, I know there are many shots where that's just not possible, and of course, you want some cool shots where the camera moves and it really gives the viewer the feeling that these 3D objects are in the world. But remember that every really cool shot like that is going to require a potentially large amount of time in post. So locking your camera down on a tripod is usually just the easiest and fastest solution for most of your shots. I even have a little method where you can not only add camera shake in post, but whole camera movements, panning left and right, tilting up and down, as if the cameraman were really looking around the world. Well, that's what I did for this shot here where Artie is shooting robots and we're seeing it from his point of view. Now, when I went out that day, I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to do this shot, so I shot it a few different ways so that I had some options in post. I first tried putting the camera on a tripod, pointing it in one direction, leaving it for a few seconds, and then moving it real quickly, as if I'm Artie looking out into the field shooting the robots, and then I would move it to another spot. I was thinking, okay, I'll have to animate in the robots, moving really fast left and right. I've done that before. But then I thought, what if we just get static shots of the whole field from this one tripod position and stitch them together in post? So I did that too. As you can see here, I just pointed the camera in every direction possible for a few seconds, and then in After Effects I stitched all of them together to create a very, very huge resolution image that I could use as my backdrop or plate. And there wasn't too much movement in the trees or anything, so that helped with the stitching together. But let's say your shot is really intense and you absolutely cannot lock down your camera and add all this stuff in post. The very least you should do is to use a nice fluid head tripod or a shoulder rig. If you can't afford it, try to borrow or rent one from a friend or from the many film gear peer-to-peer rental services that are out there now, such as GridShare. I haven't used them yet, but they look awesome. Also, make sure that your camera lens has stabilization in it, because a shot from something like a handheld cell phone with all of its sharp jitteriness might even end up being a shot that Blender or any other tracking program won't be able to work with at all. It might just go, nah, I'm just not going to do that. Here's an error. If you want to add intense camera shake in post, remember to leave room around the edges of the frame while you're shooting, because you're going to have to crop these edges to cut out gaps created by the artificial shake. Okay, so you have your footage and it's time to track it, so your robot can be placed in the world. So for tracking, you'll see I've only left our main camera on layer 1, I put the model on layer 2, the armature on layer 3, the floor, that's only going to exist to catch and show the shadows, is on layer 11 down here in the corner, and the muzzle flares on layer 4. Now this just makes it easier to deal with all of these elements separately later after we've tracked our footage. Now I'll be using this shot here, which is included with the Puma model in the folder if you want to go try it out. Alright, to start with, make sure layers 1 and 2 are turned on. Go into your camera with Control 0 on the number pad. If you haven't already, you can put the video behind your model to see it in action. Hit N for the properties and go to background. Choose movie clip instead of image on top. And select our 4488 footage. You can even change the opacity of it in the viewport. Hit Shift F to fly around the world with the camera using the WASD keys, Q and E to go straight up and down, and your mouse, and Shift to move real fast, and line it up roughly with how you want this robot to be lined up in the shot. And now to go into the motion tracking mode, Blender has recently added a whole new screen layout called motion tracking. So if you click up here on the screen layout preset button, you should have one called motion tracking, and it should look like this. Now, if for whatever reason you don't have a motion tracking layout, you pretty much only need 2 windows. So let's say you're back here in the default screen. I can just change this one down here to the movie clip editor, which is these clapper sticks here, also known as a slate. Make sure that its type is set to clip, and choose another window, like up here, which is good, and kind of long horizontally. Set it to Movie Clip Editor 2, but set this one's type to Graph. It's also good to have a 3D view somewhere in here. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to the main layout, and you need to get your video clip loaded in. You can go down and hit Open, and navigate to your video. Or if you've already loaded the clip previously, you can hit the film strip icon to see all the video files currently loaded into this Blender file. And there it is! Let me mention that, as you can see, this shot has very little camera shake to it, making it a fairly easy shot to track. I also don't walk forwards or backwards or anything like that, which makes it even easier. However, I am going to do a tougher shot after this one, with more camera shake and where the camera physically moves around the world, in case you happen to have to work with a more difficult shot like that. Now that we are in the tracking window, we'll set up the camera's settings so that Blender knows what this was shot with, to help it understand it a little bit better, to help it track it a little bit better. So over on the right, under Camera, you'll see camera presets, as well as sensor width and pixel aspect ratio. If you know the model number of the camera that was used to film your footage, go punch it into Google with the words sensor width after it, and you'll get all of this information that you need. I use the Canon T5i, so when I type that in, I get this. It looks like the sensor size is 22.3, and the actual sensor itself is the APS-C sensor. And if you're going to be using digital cameras, even as a hobbyist, knowing the sensor sizes of cameras out there is extremely helpful when trying to figure out the quality of that camera. So now that we know the sensor size, and with that information, we can just hit camera presets and select that sensor, and it will set things up for us, which is nice. One thing I'll note here is that tracking a shot in Blender is not as cut and dry as other things like modeling or texturing. It's a little more organic of a process, and especially due to the randomness that a video will provide. Even if you follow every step perfectly, it's possible that you won't get a good track, and most likely you're gonna have to start over trying different settings for maybe everything. Sometimes, if you're getting nowhere, it's good to try completely random settings, like setting this to something like any other option on here, or leaving it as a default, just to see what it gives you, and to get a better understanding of maybe where Blender is messing up or how it's interpreting your footage. The same goes for the focal length. If you know what lens you were using, definitely set it to that millimeter. I had an 18 to 55 millimeter zoom lens on my camera. A good idea while you're filming is to take notes on all this information, or say out loud for the camera's audio to pick up while you're shooting stuff like what millimeter the lens is at, or any other information you know is going to be helpful in the post-production process. Another thing to note is that if you do have a zoom lens, don't do any zooming during a VFX shot. Blender doesn't like that. Now, before we do anything else, we want to load the whole video into the RAM to have it play back faster for us. And you can do that on the left under the Track tab. Then under Clip, where it says Prefetch, hit that and you'll see a little dark, transparent purple bar at the bottom turn into a nice bright purple bar. That's Blender caching the frames into the RAM. If the whole bar doesn't turn purple for you when you prefetch it, that is because Blender has a limit on the cache, and as long as you have enough RAM, we can increase that. So go up to File, User Preferences, and under System, way down at the bottom, you'll see Sequence Clip Editor with a memory cache limit. Now, it's best to set this depending on how long your video is. My video is 16 seconds long, and for me, setting it to about 5,120 megabytes, or roughly 5 gigs, was enough for me. But if you're still having trouble, you can set this higher, as long as you got the RAM. Next, we'll add some tracking markers. As you can see, I did not place any physical tracking points in the real world when I filmed this because I was lazy, and I felt there were enough rocks and pebbles on the ground with high enough contrast that it should work. But it's always good practice to place tracking markers on the ground or trees or walls, and I actually created some and put them in the Puma folder that are already the size of 8.5 by 11 printer paper, so you can just print them out, cut them up, and tape them to stuff. For now, we're gonna work with this shot, and we'll start with the easiest method of placing markers. First, on the right, go to Marker Display and check Search. You'll see why in a minute. Make sure you are on your first frame in this project file. It's set to frame 5, just because he's kind of going into his T-pose between frames 1 and 4. And then hit Detect Features over on the left. This will place markers automatically on points that Blender feels have a high enough contrast. So any dark rocks on the light-colored dirt, or maybe lighter rocks on the darker areas of the shot. And if I uncheck and check that search button again, you can see that we get the search area where the marker will be looking for that point. Okay, back on the left, scroll down under Track. Hit A twice just to make sure they're all highlighted yellow, and hit the little right arrow to track forwards. It would definitely be great if this is all we had to do, but after we track forwards, we are most likely gonna have a lot of tracks fall off or get lost and then need to delete them and place our own manually. But sometimes we get lucky and this takes out at least some of the work for us, so, you know, why not give it a shot? You'll see that some have lost their contrasty points, so we're just going to delete them. First, select all of them with A, and then hit Control-L to lock them so that we don't move them by accident. Then hit A again, and zoom in on a section to find the ones that don't have these red lines. And select them and delete them with X. You can also come up to the graph and zoom in to find ones that either seem to stop abruptly or that are just totally out of whack and go way further up or down compared to the rest of the main group. Select them and delete them. You can box select some with B. That looks good. Now, before we add any more, let's take a look at the top left where it says Motion Model. And it's set to LOC, or Location. And for an easy shot like this, that would probably be fine. But if you want it to be even more refined, you can try a Fine. And if you had a lot of tracks break during the last forward track that we did, you may also need to increase the pattern size and the search size. You can try something like 50 pattern size and 100 search area. But remember that the bigger they are, the longer they're going to take to track. And if you then hit Detect Features, it's going to create a lot of those very large markers, making it take a very long time to track. Also, for more shaky footage, you might need larger search areas. So I'm going to leave it at 2171 for this very simple shot here. Now we're going to add more markers automatically again. So make sure you're at the beginning by hitting the double left arrows at the bottom, and hit Detect Features, and hit Track Forwards. Sometimes it won't even get a frame or two, and they all seem to break. So undo and hit Detect again, and see if you can get it to work. That time it worked. Okay, as you can see, I'm speeding this part up, but after it finishes tracking, I'm just going through the same process of locking the markers with Control L and deleting the bad ones. So we're gonna have to place some markers manually, which you will always have to do anyway, so let's do it now. Just hold Control and left click on any point of high contrast like this, and do that about 5 or 10 times. You can see what the marker sees up here in the top right. Just make sure that it's very unique, high contrasty point. I like to land that little yellow crosshairs on a spot that I can recognize, so that if I want to fix this marker later, say it fell off track, I'll know exactly what this was supposed to be looking at. So it seemed to keep stopping after the first frame, and what I did was I changed the first frame from 5 to 6, and that seemed to fix it. So now we're starting on frame 6. And as you can see, I'm just fast forwarding again, but I just repeat the process of placing about 10 markers, tracking forwards, and deleting the bad ones until I have something between 40 and 50 really good markers. So now we want to finalize this track, also called solving it. So on the left, go to the Solve tab. It says keyframe A and B, and set your keyframe A and B to the range you feel had the best markers, or the ones that stuck the most, that gave you the least amount of problems. And if you just don't know, you can hit the keyframe button up here. It does have to start on the first frame, so I'm going to set that to 6. Now, since I don't physically walk around, I only hold the camera in my hand and stand in one place, I can check off tripod, which makes things much easier for Blender. Then under Refine, I choose focal length K1, K2, which will automatically adjust some of the focal length settings, and I found this one to be the best for me. Then go to the beginning with the double arrows again, select all with A just to be safe, and then hit Solve Camera Motion, and it will take a little bit to solve. And oh no, we got a solve error. Just kidding. Everyone gets that. And they say if it's under 1, then it's great. If it's between 1 and 3, it's good. And if it's above 3, that's horrible and terrible, and you have to redo it. So you have to go back and change settings, or find bad markers that maybe you missed, or that slipped off their track points and kept going all the way to the end anyway. So you might have to go back and really analyze each one. But we got a .644. But one thing you can try that seems to make it a little better is you can set the focal length to 19 and solve again right now with that. And as you can see, we got 6.414. Fine, whatever. It's only a tiny bit better, but it's something. And you can flip back and forth by using Control-Alt-Z, going to the last solve, and going forward again to the other one. Under Display, if you hit Render Undistorted, you can see how much distortion it had to create around the edges because of all this focal changing business going on, I'm pretty sure. And I also believe we want the least amount of distortion possible. Now, if you had a solve above 1, try setting this error value under Cleanup on the left to 1 and hitting Cleanup Tracks, and sometimes that will help. You might have to hit Solve Camera Motion again. But it's looking good for us, so I'm going to move these windows to see my 3D view up top and get the camera I was working with and move it to layer 1 by selecting it, hitting M, and then hitting number 1. And as you can see under Camera Information tab, it seems to already have set this camera to the focal value it says it should be at. If we go to the Constraints tab with the chain icon, we want to add a constraint. And Camera Solver. And if it has all these little X's in front of it, then we have given it the correct thing. It's hard to see it moving because the camera shake is so slight, but if I zoom in, you can see it. Now, I want to get my shadow catcher layer over here, which I misplaced at some point. It should be on layer 11 down in the left corner in the file you downloaded. Now let's jump over to the default layout. If you haven't already, you can put the video behind your model to see it in action. Just go into the camera with Control and 0 on the number pad, hit N for the properties, and go to background and select our 4488 footage. Now I'm going to move this floor to where it should be on layer 11 and only have layer 1 selected so you can see the model sticking to the real world footage. Now his feet aren't perfectly steady because translating a human motion capture file to these weird clunky feet isn't easy. But if we want to see just how good our track is, Just add a cube and place it on the grid anywhere, or even try to line it up with his feet. Because we chose the tripod option, there really isn't a floor that the camera understands that we have to worry about at the moment. So I'm just going to put it here, and as you can see when I play it, it seems like it's staying pretty stationary with this dirt here. And if I move it to something, we can use a reference point like this little white dot so you can see how much it's really sticking. So alright, maybe he's too far away. Since we did the tripod option, we can move the camera around with little worry of messing up his stickiness to the ground, as I like to call it. So we can select the camera and just move it closer to him, and it all still seems to work. We can see how that corner sticks with that dark spot. And if you go up to the Render Layer tab, you should only have 3 layers. Floor layer, floor with shadow, and object layer. There shouldn't be any others in the file you downloaded. Also, by the way, if you hit N and go back to these background image properties, you can make the video brighter and even see the distortion here. And the last thing is if you turn the floor layer on with Shift and select layer 11 and set your view to rendered, I'm using the pie menus, which you can turn on in add-ons, we'll see the shadows that are being cast from the HDRI that we're using. And of course, with the way I have the nodes set up, the floor will disappear, and when you render it, only the shadows will remain. Alright, here's a shot that is deliberately shaky, that I'm going to track in case you have a very shaky shot too, where the camera operator walks around, that you have to deal with. But let me tell you, this was not easy, and I mean that. Don't stop me from telling you, let me tell you. So I've loaded this new shot, and we're going to start by choosing the same settings as before. Sensor APS-C, focal length, something around 15mm. I've already changed the timeline to match the only part of this video that I want to use. Make sure we're at the beginning, prefetch the footage again. Let's detect features. I'm going to box select all the ones that are not on the solid ground in front of us for this one. And even these on these bushes over here on the right, as the wind might have been moving them around a little, messing things up. I even add some manually, and you can see I first try the LOC and the Affine motion models on the left, and they don't work out too well. So let's switch the motion model to perspective and control left click on a dark spot. Now if you grab the bottom right of the search area, you can scale it up. And if you grab the top left, you can move it. Then grab the little line sticking out of the inside marker and rotate it and scale it up. And let's track backwards and see what happens. So you can see it hit the side of the frame and stopped. Well, you can fix that by grabbing a corner of the inner marker and moving it. And moving it doesn't affect the center track point really, but it does help the overall marker in certain situations. Track backwards again and it stops again, so I'm going to fix it and start it up again, and it doesn't hit anything this time. And it gives us a pretty good track. I'll do a few more the same way, and since these are perspective markers, they really want to understand the perspective of the plane that they're sitting on. And you can help them with that by warping these points. So try to warp it in a way that lines up with the ground, or whatever plane it is that you're putting it on. And normally they do pretty good. This one lost its track because the shot got blurry, but it looks like if I just increase the size and back up one frame and try again from here, it's gonna go. And do about 10 or 20 like this, and you should be able to finish this shot soon. When you're ready, go to your Solve tab and set your keyframe A and B to the range you feel had the best markers, or the ones that stuck the most, that gave you the least amount of problems. And if you just don't know, you can hit the keyframe button up here. Mine is pretty even throughout the whole thing, so I made it the entire thing. Set the refine, like before, to focal length K1, K2, and solve. And we got a 0.21. Nice. Okay, we'll go back to the default window and select the camera. And make sure you give it a camera solver constraint under the Constraints tab again. And if we zoom in on the camera, we can see that the points all seem to be bunched up right in front of it. And if these are supposed to represent that whole dirt clearing that we just tracked, something must be wrong here. But this happens often, and it's actually a simple fix. So let's go back to the motion tracking layout and fix it. So the problem is that the scale is off. This large area of points in our video here can't possibly be this little area here. So select 3 solid points that run throughout the whole video and hit floor on the left. It may look weird in your 3D view at first, but they're just ending up on the grid floor. That's all that's happening. It's these 3 orange ones here. Now select just one this time that stays there throughout the whole video, and this one's going to end up at the center of the grid. So to do that, with it selected, hit Set Origin on the left, and any one that you select and set as the origin goes to the center of the grid. Now to fix the scale, select 2 points that are a decent distance away from one another, and on the left, set the distance to something like 10, and hit scale to see what you get. As you can see, the camera and its point cloud started to scale up, so we're getting somewhere. With the same 2 selected, set it to 20 and hit scale again. And we might be pretty close to the scale we were going for. I'm gonna make another 3D view and hit 7 on the number pad to go into the top view. And make sure you're in orthographic view with 5 on the number pad. And rotate and move the camera to get the robot walking past it in the way that you want. It's a little tricky, but instead of possibly messing up the robot's animation by moving him, I'm just going to move the camera into place. And if you look closely, the most important thing is that the robot's feet line up with this point cloud floor of sorts, which is representative of that dirt floor that we just tracked. If I click on points, I can start to get a feel for whether or not these distances seem right now. I'll zoom in and check some more. So like before, to check this setup, we're going to add a cube and put it on the same level. So that's looking good, but this shot, you know, required quite a bit of work to get a good track. If you have the luxury, try to spend time planning out your shot by placing good high contrast markers around the set or your location, using a tripod, using a Steadicam, shoulder rig, and a camera lens with stabilization in it, and try to make any camera moves as smooth as possible all the time, and adding camera shakes in post-production. This is how you would go about adding that camera shake to a shot. In the compositor, you want to just add a transform node and a scale node, and connect them like this as the last thing in the node tree or node chain. And starting at the first frame, hover over the X and hit the I key, and hover over the Y and hit I again. And open up your graph window up top. And open up these on the left until you get to the compositor nodes that are now here because we added those keyframes. Select one, hit N to get the right side properties, and go to the Modifiers tab. Then add a noise modifier and set its strength to, let's say, 130, which is good for a pretty good amount of shake for our 1920 by 1080 video clip. And if we zoom out, you can see how high these graph lines begin to reach. but we want them to be more spaced apart for realistic camera shake, not like someone just fell down a cliff holding the camera. So for scale, set it to 15. And in the compositor window, if you have the backdrop checked off over here, and you recently rendered a frame, you should see your video back here. Now, since we tracked our footage starting at frame 5, we want to make sure we are now always starting on frame 5. Otherwise, we might not see this video. And of course, make sure you have this video loaded up in the video node. That's toward the left of the node tree. That's already set up in this Blender file. Zoom into a corner with Alt-V, and zoom out with just the V key, and move to the corner by holding Alt and dragging with the scroll or the middle mouse button. And scrub through the timeline and see how much shake you're getting by how much black there now is around the edge of the frame, which we're going to take out in a minute. Also, don't forget to go back to the curves window and select the other Y value and give it the same noise modifier with 130 strength and 15 scale. And we have it shaking around in all directions. And you can even animate it for more or less shake by again hitting I over the values here, then moving forward in time and changing them. Make sure auto keyframing is on the bottom, otherwise you'll have to hit I over these values every single time you want to add a new keyframe. If you have a lot of objects that you don't feel like waiting for to render just to test out this shake, just make sure you are only on layer 1 and the only thing on that layer is the camera. Then we want to get rid of the gaps around the edges. Check the graph again for the highest and lowest points of these peaks and valleys here to find the time when the frame is going to be moved the furthest. Then increase the scale on the scale node. It's very touchy though, so see how far like 1.05 goes, and do that for both. So let's try 1.14 on both. And voila! So to see your camera shake in real time, you might have to render out a test shot. What I do is I lower the duration of the video to just a few seconds, because that's all you really need. And then I go up to the render settings and the output, and I set this to H.264 output with a QuickTime format and a bitrate of something between 5,000 and 15,000, depending on how high quality I want to see this test render in. And then I set the samples to 1 because I'm not rendering any objects right now. And choose your output file. And then hit Control F12. And here is the export next to the original. For you After Effects users who are used to layers and pre-comps instead of nodes like this, I was the same way in the beginning, but it seems like you can do a lot of the same stuff that you do with your layers and your pre-comps if you just set up the nodes in the right way. What I did when I was first learning nodes in Blender, after coming from After Effects, was to stack them on top of each other instead of side by side like they are. My brain was used to seeing how effects interacted with each other on a top-down basis, as if the final camera or viewer was looking downwards onto everything, and by rearranging these like this, it helped me isolate when certain effects were taking place. Now, I love After Effects for its speed and ease of use and everything, but nodes are simply more powerful because instead of that limited world of layers that you're forced to use, in this more open world here of the node compositing window, you can skip effects completely and combine them and plug them into things way downstream, and you can actually use things called passes that allows you to alter certain parts of the scene without changing the whole final render. It gets real crazy, but this is why the compositing program Nuke is used in high-end VFX studios around the world, because it also uses nodes. Okay, let's take a look at our render settings. Over in the render tab, it starts out pretty basic. I'm leaving this on the CPU for anyone who doesn't have a high-end graphics card, but if you do, you can of course change that. I have the resolution currently at 1920 by 1080, and we're working in 24 frames per second. If you want to make this a very high resolution animation so you can zoom in on him if you need to in post-production or whatever, you can come over here to the render dimensions and change this from 100 to something like 200. Now note that the final output will be something close to 4K. So you know how we're used to using 1920 by 1080? Well, double that is 4K. And you could actually turn this percentage up or this X and Y value up to whatever you want, and it's like having a 4K or 8K or whatever camera in Blender for free, which is pretty amazing. But remember, of course, the higher the number, the longer it's going to take to render. But for the purposes of this overview, I'm going to keep this at 100. I use metadata for my test renders sometimes to keep track of what settings took how long and add notes about whether I used the CPU or the GPU that time, if I added motion blur or not, how high my subsurface modifier was set to, my samples, and anything else I changed for that test shot. To do that, check the stamp output here. Under output here, I use the PNG image, and if we're going to be adding the robot into some footage right here in Blender, you can leave it as RGB. Under sampling, one thing I like to do is animate the seed value, because that will give us a bit of randomness to the grain or the noise that naturally occurs in the final clip. And when it is not animated, it has this weird static look where there seems to be like these little particles that just hang there in front of the camera. But when it is animated, it acts more like real film grain in live-action cameras, which is especially important when you're trying to composite this robot into live-action footage. So to do this, open up Graph Editor. I'm going to get rid of the animation I had on there, and then just start at frame 0 and hover over this seed value and hit I, which adds a keyframe. Back in the Graph Editor, you can rename it to Film Grain. We're going to animate it using a modifier, which changes it automatically for every frame going into the future. Select the seed on the left, hit N to make sure you have your right side properties. Go to the Vertical Modifiers tab, hit Add Modifier, Generator, and that's it, actually. The defaults are all good. It's going to just add 1 to the seed value every time it advances a frame, creating that randomness. A new seed is a new random value, and we get our moving film grain. Back in the Renders tab, down here, I have Clamp Direct set to 0 and Clamp Indirect set to 3 to try to help reduce fireflies. As for the samples, they range depending on what I'm exporting. If the robot is going to be far away or blurry or will end up with a ton of motion blur on it, I might as well save some render time and reduce this. So for shots like that, I might go between 50 and 150. Then for medium shots of the robot, I might go between 200 and 300. Then for close-ups, I'll do 300 or higher if it seems like it needs it. This is where lots of test renders come in handy to try to keep this number as low as possible, keeping your render times as short as possible. Then for light paths, these are the settings that I've found to provide the best results while still maintaining a reasonable render time. Transparency, max, is set to 6, and minimum is set to 0. Shadows are on. Reflective and refractive caustics are both off to help reduce fireflies. That's also why filter glossy is set to 2, and then bounces are at a max of 6 and a minimum of 0. Diffuse is 4, glossy is 4, transmission is 4, and volume is 1. These have worked out well for this robot. Now you're probably gonna want to have motion blur on for this robot, because it obviously makes it look more real, but it is going to increase your render time, so you might want to turn it off for now for any test shots or test renders that you do, and then you're going to have to turn it back on for the final render and just deal with however long it takes. Or, if you own After Effects and you were planning on exporting this robot from Blender with a transparent background, importing it into After Effects for your tracking and your compositing into your live action footage, it's way better to leave motion blur off here in Blender, and in After Effects, just to the robot, add an effect called Pixel Motion Blur. It's an amazing effect that adds blur to only the moving pixels, and it's even added it to like the limbs that move behind each other. When it returns back into the scene, it really knows what pixels are moving and what aren't, and it does it faster than if you had to do it here in Blender. Obviously, there are different reasons why you might need motion blur on the original in Blender, but if you were going to export this robot and bring him in After Effects, that's something to try. Since we're talking about render times, this is a good time to mention the free render farm for Blender users called Shaky. It is an amazing render service where the entire community helps each other out. So it doesn't cost money, but you do have to share your computing power sometimes. So you're actually rendering other people's renders. You get credits for that time spent sharing your own computer power that you can then use to render your own projects. What I do is I lend out my computing power to this Shaky render farm overnight. I get a bunch of credits, and then when it's time, a couple weeks later or whatever, for me to render a huge scene that would take super long on my computers, I send it out to this render farm with all of my credits that I've earned, and it gets it done like 5 or even 10 times faster than what I can do. And really the way it works is the more points you have, the higher priority your project is in the line of people all trying to render their projects. So it's a little hard to grasp how it all works at first, but you just have to start by going to the site and downloading the program, and it's totally safe. I run it on 3 of my own computers. And what I'd suggest is, once you have, let's say, a few hundred or a few thousand points, that would be a good time to then start rendering your own projects with the service. I'm only taking this much time to talk about it because it really is an unbelievable resource, and frankly should be utilized by every Blender user, seeing as how it's free. And if you don't have, you know, thousands of dollars to spend on a brand new computer every year to keep up with graphics needs, this is a great solution. One thing I'll note is that I've been having some problems with using it with Firefox, and I think I just need to update some things or something, but it also might be because of something that Mozilla did with Java and how they're using it now or not using it. I'm not exactly sure, but I have found that working with Shaky on Chrome has worked for me. So if you run into any problems, try Chrome or try a different browser. Alright, let's get back to render settings. We're up to this drop down called Film, and under it is a transparent button, and it's checked for this project so that our video comes up behind the robot like how we wanted it. And if you want to export images with transparency, in the compositor window, I left 2 other setups so that you can export out just the robot and then just his shadow, so they can be put back together in another program such as After Effects. To export just the robot, select the output node for the middle setup, and only select the object render layer in the Render Layers tab. Then make sure it is set to RGBA for the PNG image, and have transparent set under Film. And that will give you this. Then, for getting just the shadow, select the bottom output nodes, and only select the floor with shadow render layer, and again have it on RGBA and Film transparent. And you'll get this. To put them back together, you just have to lay them over each other, then crop around his shadow, and get rid of the solid black area that wasn't the white floor, which the nodes automatically used as a matte for us. And blur it a little bit, and maybe mess with the contrast and duplicate it if you need to make it darker. And there you have it. This Film Transparent button also lets you see your HDRI, or not, when you're in rendered viewport mode. Under Performance, I just like to make sure I have auto tile size on, which is a great time saver if you're switching between CPU and GPU and don't want to have to keep changing this from 32 by 32 for CPU and then to 256 by 256 for GPU. To have this on, go up to User Preferences under File and Add-ons, and under Add-ons search for Auto Tile and make sure it's checked. Then make sure it is turned on down here. Okay, so if you're ready to export some footage, let's set a path in the output section. Name it whatever you want. Then make sure everything looks good. then hit Control F12, and it will start rendering out to that folder. If you're going to use the free render farm Sheepit, you would just make sure everything is perfect in your project file, and make sure the whole project file is under 500 megabytes. And go to the site, go to Projects, and go to Add Your Project. And upload that file. And when it's done uploading, it's going to ask you what type of color management you want to use. And when you're there, you get a drop-down menu where you can choose Filmic Blender if you set that up like we did earlier in this tutorial. Then there will be a button for administration where you can see what frames have been rendered and preview them and make sure everything looks right. And in there, you can tell it to use people's graphics cards too, which is good. So whether you render there or on your own computer, you're going to end up with a folder of rendered images, and you're going to want to put them all back together. And we can do that simply with the video sequence editor in Blender. So in Blender, find the video sequence editor window layout up in the top left. When you're there, hit Add at the bottom and choose Image. And go to the folder that you rendered to and hit A to select all of them. And import that. And make sure your frame range is correct to encompass how long this video is. You could edit your whole movie in here this way, bring in any other shots, and you can even add in effects from my free VFX sample pack over at dreamfirefilms.com under Products and Gun Warfare VFX Pack. If you download the free sample, you'll get a muzzle flash and a bullet hole and a few other things. You can import them and place it above your footage by going to Add Movie and going to the Gun Warfare Action Pack folder and importing the muzzle flash MOV, and it's now in your footage. And you can do that with any of those files. Then on the right next to Blend, switch it over to Alpha Over. You can move it into place with the G key. You can use most of the same hotkeys that you use everywhere else in Blender. Then to move it around the frame up here, we want to go back to Add and go to Effect Strip, then add a Transform Effect Strip. Do the same thing, set its blend to Alpha Over. Now you can hide the muzzle flash layer with H and just work with the transform layer. If you select the transform layer on the right, you can change its opacity. And if you want to change its hole size, set uniform scale, and we can type in 0.7, and set its rotation to 180 to spin it around. Adjust it a little bit by dragging these sliders. Now slide the positions X and Y sliders to move it into place on the end of the gun. And if you grab this little arrow, you can drag it in and make it one frame. And box select with B both of these and hit Shift D to duplicate them and move them outward. And now you have another one for the next time that left gun shoots again. And you can repeat this, box select those and duplicate them, and now you have 4. And I'm going to do that until I have 16. And then you can go to each one and move it into place individually. And to finalize everything, open up your render settings again, like how I have up here in the top left, and choose your output file. And if you want one final video clip, switch PNG to H.264, which will compress the video so it's good for small file sizes while still keeping some alright quality. And I use a bitrate of 15,000, which will give you a good, decent mid-range quality. You can make it higher for better quality, but you'll get larger file sizes. Or if you have a lot of fast-moving camera moves, you might want to go a little higher, say 20,000 or so. You might have to do some tests to see what works for you. And then hit Control F12. Also on the products page, we have a premium mech available if you're looking for another one to have a battle with, or to use for a film, documentary, or video game or something like that. And when you purchase a premium product like this, A portion of the proceeds will go to the Blender Foundation to help keep making Blender better and better for everyone. If you want to just add pre-rendered robots to your movie though, without any of the 3D work, I even created this Robot Soldier VFX pack. You can get it in 4K or 2K, and he's been rendered from 10 different angles, with effects and without effects. So you can put him in almost any movie, pretty easily. After you track your shot, you literally just drag and drop him into the battle. And you got yourself a sci-fi war, my friend. And be sure to subscribe and like this video so I can keep bringing you more stuff. Alright, catch you later.